I want to thank you for joining me again as we continue on with our series, From Other to One Another, our daily devotional series that accompanying our Sunday morning sermon series. I want to thank you for joining us for that as we explore the richness of our relationships with one another. If I were to ask most of you, what is the characteristic of Jesus that you most define, that you would say is the attribute that we must demonstrate the most? I think most of you would say his attribute of love. I think a close second would be the attribute of service. Jesus said of himself that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus, in that verse, really points us to the identity that we are to have in Jesus Christ in our relationship with God. Oftentimes we think of God as some ethereal power out there somewhere, but throughout Scripture, and particularly in the Old Testament, in identifying himself in a relationship with the people of Israel, and then in the book of Revelation as he demonstrates his power and authority, and then finally in the parables that Jesus tells, God often represents himself as king. Now, when the scripture tells us that we ought to serve one another, we would tend to think, or be servants of one another, or be slaves of one another. We would tend to think in terms of slavery as described in the American states, that which we had to go to war to abolish, and which still has ripple effects in our culture. However, the best definition of what's going on here with the term servant or slave is to understand in the Middle Eastern culture, he wasn't talking about that kind of slavery. They were really talking about our allegiance and devotion to God as king. That God as king is the one to whom we bow in service, that we place ourselves before him. And as we look at that idea of bowing in service before the king, and then we turn to John chapter 13, and Jesus wraps a towel around himself, and he bends down, and he takes the position of the servant that was farthest down the rung. The king becomes the servant. And then he tells the disciples, what I've done for you, do for one another. That runs in direct opposition with how our country thinks and how the disciples thought. Well, the disciples that night had just been embroiled in an argument about who was the best, who was the greatest, who deserved to be front line and right next to Jesus in the line of authority. When it comes to greatness, we often think of athletes and superstars and Hollywood actors, those people in the limelight. God says, Those aren't superstars. The superstars are those who serve others. Those who reflect the character of a king who did not come to be served, but came to serve. Sometimes we have trouble with stepping down, looking down the line, serving those who are less than ourselves. That's what service is. Giving to those who we have no expectation are able to give back, to repay what we have given them.